I know she had a lot of friends, and I know that Andrew Sean Greer was one of those friends. And I would like to introduce him now to start us off at the top of the evening before we welcome our two alumni. Andrew Sean Greer is the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of 6 works of fiction, including the bestsellers The Confessions of Max Tivoli and Less. Greer has taught at a number of universities, including the Iowa Writers Workshop, been a Today Show pick, a New York Library Coleman Center Fellow, a judge for the National Book Award, and a winner of the California Book Award and the New York Public Library Young Lions Award. He's the recipient of an NEA grant, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and the 2018 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. Folks, I want to welcome my friend and Catherine's friend, Andrew Sean Greer.
Hey, I'm so honored to be able that when Wiley asked me to come here, because I knew Katherine from the McDowell colony, where Wiley and I met, and where Katherine and I met, and it's a place I might have seen some of the best parts of her. You know, I didn't know her as a teacher. I knew her as a writer of a beautiful fiction, and as an infectious humor and joyous spirit. And I don't think we got into too much trouble there, but it's a way to it's a place for artists of all kinds to feel sort of like when you first start creating, when you feel like a child, you can't believe what you can come up with. And I got to share that with her. And I remember that I introduced her to Twitter, which this was like 7 or 8 years ago, back when we thought Twitter was a way to sort of just let your friends know what bar you were at. No one thought any strangers would follow you, you know, because why would anyone do that? So you would just post absolutely where you were and what you were doing. And I was like, Katherine, you gotta join, it'll be great. We can see what each other are doing. And immediately she joined, and she wrote me in a panic saying that she was like, all these people are following me. I don't know them. I'm freaking out. And she was the first person to clue me in that there might be a darker side to Twitter than what I thought, which was like, you know, I'm going to play basketball or something. But it was fun to watch her panic at technology and to watch her take fiction so seriously. And I'm really happy to be here with Zephyr and Jesse to do these readings, and also to get to meet her brother and her parents who are here, and to let them know what important person she was in the writing world for all of us. It's also fun to see all these faces, and somewhere in here possibly is my Aunt Gwen, but there's too many for me to look through because she lives in Asheville, and she follows me on Twitter. I'm gonna read something a little brief, just a few minutes from long ago. It's a book I published around the time that I met Katherine, called The Story of a Marriage. And it's a little moody, but I think that's appropriate. Set in 1953. If you clenched your right hand in a fist, that would be my San Francisco, knocking on the Golden Gate. Your little finger would be a sunny downtown on the bay, and your thumb would be our ocean beach out on the blue Pacific. They called it the Sunset. That's where we lived, with our son on an old property set like a rough stone among the thousands of new houses put up for returning soldiers and their families, in a part of the city no one really built on until the war was over. The hills were flattened, soil was laid down over the sand, and they built a grid of streets and low pastel houses with garages and Spanish roofs and picture windows that flashed with the appearance of the sun, all in rows for 50 avenues until you reached the ocean. It felt outside of everything. Once the Chronicle published a map of nuclear damage to San Francisco. If hit with rings of rubble and fire, the Sunset was the only district to survive. When we first moved in after the war, there were so many empty lots that sand always glittered in the air and it could bury a vegetable garden overnight. Above the sound of the ocean, One could sometimes hear the early morning roar of the lions in the nearby zoo. It was nothing like the rest of the city, no hills or views or bohemians, nothing Italian or Victorian to make you take a photograph. A new way to live, separated from downtown by more than just a mountain with one tunnel. It sat on the very edge of the continent, with fog so dense and silver you hardly ever saw a sunset. In the sunset, any glowing light was often just a streetcar emerging like a miner from that tunnel, making its satisfied way out to the ocean. It was a Saturday. It was 1953, and weeks before, we had all watched on television as President Eisenhower and Richard Nixon were sworn in as the first government we could remember neither to be led nor haunted by FDR. We watched that inauguration, full of worries about the Korean War, race issues, the Rosenbergs, the communists hidden everywhere around us, the Russian bombs being prepared and inscribed like voodoo charms with our very names, Pearlie, Holland, Sunny. We watched and told ourselves, help is coming. People have an idea about the 50s. They talk about poodle skirts and bus strikes and Elvis. They talk about a young nation, an innocent nation. I don't know why they have it so wrong. It must be the consolidation of memory, because all that came later as the country changed. In 1953, nothing had changed. We were still so haunted by the war. by the war. Fluoridation seemed like a horrible new invention, and the Woolworth Sun Market a beautiful one. In those days, the firemen still wore leather helmets. William Platt, the seltzer boy, left fizzing bottles on our doorstep, waking me with the ring of glass on concrete. The milkman still drove his old-fashioned wagon with gold script on the sides, freckles rustle, and impossible as it seems, the Iceman still pulled blocks out with his medieval tongs like a dentist doing an extraction on a whale, making his rounds from these last few households without a refrigerator. The rag man and the knife man, the fruit truck and the cold truck and the dry cleaners, the fish man and the colonial bread man and the egg lady all came down the street with their echoing cries of rags, bottles, trash, and grind your scissors, grind your knives, a sound that's gone forever. No one had ever heard anything wilder than a big band, nor ever seen a man grow his hair longer than his ears. We were still trying to figure out how to live in a war after a war. It was the medieval time for mothers. When he was 3, my boy Sonny was playing with his loving father in the backyard when I heard shouting. I came running to find my son collapsed in the bower vine. My husband picked him up, rocking him in his arms, hushing his frightened boy, telling me to call the doctor. In those days, they had no idea what caused polio or what to do. The doctor told me it was brought on by summer, a magical diagnosis for a city without a summer. His treatment was leg splints, bed rest, and hot towels, which I applied carefully, and our only other solace was church services where weeping mothers held up photographs of children. It wasn't a time of freshness and freedom. It was a time of dread. The war was easy compared to this. It's a wonder we didn't run screaming into the streets and set fire to one another's houses. Instead, we hid our fears, just as my mother hid a lock of her dead brother's hair in the throat of her high-collared Sunday dress in a pocket she had sewn there. You cannot go around in grief and panic every day. People will not let you. They will coax you with tea and tell you to move on, bake cakes and paint walls. You can hardly blame them. After all, we learned long ago that the world would fall apart and the cities would be left to the animals, and the clambering vines of grief like a mad king were allowed to ascend the throne. So what you do is you let them coax you. You bake the cake and paint the wall and smile. You buy a new freezer as if you now had a plan for the future. And secretly, in the early morning, you sew a pocket in your skin at the hollow of your throat, so that every time you smile or nod your head at a teacher meeting or bend over to pick up a fallen spoon, it presses and pricks and stings, and you know you've not moved on. You never even planned to. It is equal to living in a tragic land, a poet once wrote, to live in tragic times. Yet I have to admit I loved our house. I had chosen it after all, in defiance of the ants. I had pressed Holland to take that old Sunset property. And at first it was the fulfillment of our dreams. A house with a yard, a bedroom my son didn't have to share, carpets and folding blinds, and even a place behind the bathroom mirror for Holland to drop his razor blades. It was a miracle, a house that had thought of everything before me. You could never have convinced me back when I was young that all the real moments of my life would happen in that vine-covered house, just as a telephone installer can't tell a young couple that their happiest and saddest news will come through that polished phone. It's hard to think even now that the sweet ebony milkmaid that Holland's aunts gave us in the first year of our marriage and that sat on the bookshelf would watch with its painted eyes every vital decision I ever made. So too the bamboo coffee table and the broken pot that Sonny had made from a drinking glass, masking tape, and shellac. The yarn cat, the broken mantel clock. They watched the whole 6 months of that affair, and in the hour of my judgment, they will surely be called together to account for things. As for what Holland's aunt told me the year before, that afternoon of tea and popovers, I had decided long before to forget it. Marriage was all that cluttered my mind, and the new house and the care of my child. I could not pay attention to the memory of an old woman shouting in her muffled voice, "Don't do it. Don't marry him." Thank you all.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Love that last line there. I want to continue the evening by introducing our first alumni reader, Zephyr Lisowski. She's a trans and queer writer and artist currently living in New York City. And she's a poetry editor for Apogee Journal and the author of Blood Box, winner of the Black River Editor's Choice Award from Black Lawrence Press. Zephyr's work has appeared in Literary Hub, Muzzle, Magazine, and Diagram, among other venues. Zephyr was a student in 2 of my creative writing classes and one of the most talented students I've ever had. Her use of language and risk-taking was exceptional. After graduating from UNCA in 2015, she went on to receive a full scholarship to Hunter College's MFA in Creative Writing program, which she completed last year, I believe. It's my pleasure to introduce Zephyr Lisowski.
Thank you so much, Lori. Everyone can hear me, correct? It's kind of overwhelming to see so many faces I recognize here, to be completely honest. I'll stop myself before I cry, but I couldn't really, so much of Lori and Holly Iglesias and Kirk Boyle and Rick Chess's instruction was deeply, deeply formative to my writing and just my life practice in general. I'm so honored to be here. I'm just going to read, and Katherine Min as well, who I'll talk about in between poems. But I'm just going to read a couple of poems, a few from my book that came out at the end of last year and one that's not from that. I just pasted in the chat an access document if anyone needs to or would prefer to follow along. It has basically what I'll be reading. But I'd like to start with a poem that's not from the book, that's a little bit more recent. It was about what I thought would be the most pressing disaster facing the United States in the immediate future, which is global warming. And clearly something else happened before then, but it's still out there. Anyways, this is called Girl Work. After the schoolyard incident, meanings blur. Average temperatures rising worldwide. My body luscious. Like, who wouldn't consume me? Like, hi, my gender is scrumptious. My pronouns are Eden/8. I love the way my hair looks in this light. Apocalyptic. You know, what's the opposite of being ruined? The oceans have grown 3 inches in our lifetimes. Like, wow, I cover my hands with salt. The news anchor says my body is a seaside. I can deny others blame for anything. After it happens, I sit on the breakers. This is what I'm trying to tell you. My disassociation becomes statistical. Yes, things are getting worse. Yes, the subway flooding with people. Yes, drought. Yes, crying scientists. When I lost my dad, I thought, wow, why am I not crying more? This is a common narrative I learned. Things are consumed every day. I fling my body into the river, the anchor moving on to another story. I don't talk about loss much. The water is still rising. That's that poem. Thank you. Yeah, feel free to clap or pay me compliments in the chat or whatever works the best for you in between poems. I'm a Pisces, so compliments are not just my language of affection, they're basically my language. I'm grateful. Pisces gang, someone said, yes, I'm really grateful to be here again. The first, I think, significant kind of outside validation of my writing came when I got the Comfort Scholarship at UNCA. And Katherine Min told me that I had received it. We had a talk in her office about it. And just that moment and her presence in general, the way in which she showed up so completely to me and to so many other students, clacking down the hall in her boots, her really, really sharp wit. I could never quite tell if she was making fun of me, but that didn't feel like an insult. It felt like a way of being included as well. Again, I want to stop myself before I cry, but that was so, that moment I think is kind of going to be etched in my memory forever. And I'm so grateful for everything that Katherine Min did at UNCA and elsewhere. I'm going to read just 2 or 3 more poems. They're pretty quick, but they're from my book that came out last year called Blood Box, which is about the queer, probably lesbian, family murderer Lizzie Borden, who lived in Massachusetts at the turn of the 20th century. She murdered her dad and stepmom and went to a big national trial for it and then got acquitted somehow. So depending on what your stance on fathers is, she could be an icon or not. I'm going to leave that open for interpretation, but I'm certainly fascinated by her. And I wrote a full book about kind of her, these poems around her and around her life. And they revolve a bunch of different speakers. I'm going to read a poem that's not from her perspective and then end with a poem that's from her perspective. So this is not from her perspective. This is from her sister Emma's point of view. And it takes place right after the murders happened. It's called There's Been a Death. Of course, no one knows what to do. August 10th, 1892. My brow is thick, my hands heavy. I redraw my face every day in this tumescent heat, hoping for an almost showy sadness. I am nothing compared to my sister. Journalists say remorseless to describe her bruised visage, as if painting only exists to create new emotions, as if kindness were an aesthetic choice. If there was anything Mrs. Borden knew, it was that, the way she buried those garden pears inside her pies, face powdered into blankness. How can any of us compete with her secrets? I tell Lizzie, of course she knew what we said of her. She knew everything, how molasses covers up the festering sweet of rot, makeup, lockbox, little hole in the ground. Grief is made by its performance. Am I bereaved? Look at me. I wear my suffering on my skin. I wear my skin on top of my other skin. I realize I actually have slightly more time than I thought. So would y'all like to hear two more poems instead of one more poem? I don't want to overstay my welcome, as it were.
Yes.
Cute. Thank you for unmuting yourself just to tell me that. Love it.
No worries.
All right. So this is another poem, not from Lizzie's perspective. This is from her stepmother, who was murdered. And it's about the institution of heterosexuality. It's called Preparing for the Wedding Anniversary, June 5th, 1890, Abby Borden. Why wouldn't I have heard the rumors? When Andrew proposed, they said, it was with a ring fetched from a dead man. Of course I realized I was wed to an undertaker. Anyone could see his face stretched taut as a morgue sheet. Tenderness wasn't what I was looking for. The house we live in sweats like a human, but the sound of his feet thumping the stairs or his face in the heat, that's something else entirely. The pear tree, its fecundity of pears. We sleep in a narrow bed, and I dream of him and embrace, spread out like a lover or thin patty of flesh. And then this is the last poem that I'm going to be reading. Thank you again. It's such an honor to be graced with you all. So for context, the first poem in the book is called If I Did. It's from Lizzie's perspective. It's sort of a hypothetical. The last poem is kind of that too. It's called If I Didn't. It takes place during the trial or right afterwards. Lizzie. Not guilty holds meanings in its skin too, and I am deeply acquainted with all of them. A series of cells dancing between my eyes, fingers corpsing on the table, the investigator peeling wallpaper from the parlor. I'm used to others' stares, their pauses. I'm used to silence. Am I haunted? Even in the courtroom, as they mouth the acquittal, I start dreaming of another life. Surely I can find happiness. I know this because I ignore my dreams and eat food regularly. I know this because I've read stories, miraculous instances of angelic visitations, shipwrecks that reverse themselves, a fire that suddenly stops burning. Do you see it? Kindness flocking like birds. I'm talking about a forgiveness so close to touching you, you can taste it. There it is, the yard over. There it is, climbing the fence. There it is, raising thin hand to rap delicately at the parlor door. Answer it. Thank you.
That was amazing, Zephyr. Thank you so much. I just want to let people know that they'll have a chance to ask the readers questions in the chat. So after Jessie finishes, we'll take questions in the chat. And so without further ado, I will introduce Jessie. Jessie Rice Evans, who graduated from UNCA in 2012, is the author of the poetry collection, The Uninhabitable. She's a disabled queer Southerner poet and rhetorician and is working on her PhD in English composition and rhetoric at the CUNY Graduate Center, where she studies digital discomposed narratives, femme rhetoric in queer and disabled communities, and embodiment theory in digital writing. She's also had 4 chapbooks of her poetry published, and her work has appeared in a variety of anthologies and journals, including Entropy, The Queer Body, and Mad Scholars Anthology. I'm so honored to welcome Jessie Rice Evans.
Hi, Zephyr said she was trying not to cry, but I've been crying since the second I opened the video. So not in a bad way, in like a, you know, community way. Yeah, it's great to see so many folks that I know and love, and to have so many folks that I don't know who are here because Katherine touched their lives in some way, and to continue supporting the awesome writing community at UNC Asheville. I didn't come straight into UNC Asheville. I actually did 3 years of undergrad at UNC. And when I realized, you know, like basketball wasn't as big of a deal for me as it seemed to be for other folks, no shade if that's your thing, I needed to take a step back and just kind of found myself at UNCA. And I've never had space quite like that to work on my own creative work since. So it's a great pleasure to see so many people that I've learned a lot from, Lori and Holly and Kirk and Colin. We met in Seattle. I don't know if you remember that, but it's great to see you too. Katherine's parents are here, which is amazing. Thank you guys so much. Your daughter is such a gift to all of us. I'll start with a short poem, and I dropped an access document in the chat earlier on. If anybody can't find it, just wave or drop me a note and I'll post it again. But I'm going to start from the top in that document. Symptoms: 1, nausea; 2, muscle cramps; 3, fatigue; 4, dry eyes; 5, loss of libido. You have done bad, but others have done worse. So I met my boyfriend, who is listening in the other room, who's also a UNCA alum, Chet Tiller, in a class with Katherine, and she loved him. I think they had some kind of really great chemistry, and he's very quiet human, and she would call on him a lot, and he just would say he didn't have anything to contribute to the conversation, which was super charming, and I could tell how much she liked him. She always laughed and at his total non-response. And so Katherine likes to take credit for the fact that we're still together, which she can have credit for that. I'm totally comfortable with it. So thanks again for that, Katherine. I'll read my second poem now, which is a poem based on some of the work of Natalie Eilberg. No, I'll read this one instead, after Danielle Profunda, called The Class War Comes Home. This made me think of UNC Asheville. A single silver braid encases cord, to which you drip from still gooed, still infant. Mother says, winch, and your furtive cry, her dollop grim, mediocre, grim and extant. Before beginning, it knows the rush, tangle, rush, still her emptying her mouth of money, coins rushing out and filling each elbow, each dimpled plane. A tether, she craves it thirstily, wants, infant and wordless in her simple seam, simple look, I promise, as long as I live, this will be the last of me. Her need to churn against void makes sense when you think about it. Little girl, loathing girl, acquiescent girl, good girl. She is a good girl and I am a bad girl, claiming a fringe as my own and keeping by it, scraping myself a nest and not leaving. Not so much a good girl in that instinctual dismissal of the cheap, not so much cheap, more withholding, more abysmal, warrior, oh bony warrior, keep shut the tap of coins that scream cacophonous from your face hole, fucking decor, fucking marble, fucking expensive appliances, fucking wealth like a skin of cedars. I'm a Leo, so I also accept compliments. Thank you. Thanks. I have one more piece, a piece of advice from Katherine that I've always kept with me in the long time since I hired Leah Shapiro, since the long time that Katherine has gave me writing advice and performance advice, which I always listen to, because if you were lucky enough to get to see her perform her own work, it was just so delightful, and they were so sexy, and she would always read, and it just killed me. I'd have to like hide under the table. It was just like, I grew up Catholic, so, but it was amazing. So, and she would say, like, if you have a kind of longer piece, save it for the end. If this piece is that much longer, I don't write super long stuff, but that was her piece of advice about kind of staggering where things go. So I kept that in mind for tonight as well. This piece is after Natalie Eilbert, who I accidentally mentioned earlier, called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. It's a good place to start the edge with puzzles, coloring, giving your all, giving. I give as if it is what I was put on this earth to do. I am okay with it. I wear a scarf with Pokemon all over it and no one notices. It's a floral, not a token of my deep-seated need to connect with the non-human, the animal, the non-human animal. For a while, I consider how to integrate each of these as icons. My need for evolution, demonstrative of my crave for change, constant change, the only thing unchangeable has to be the thing itself. I ask myself if I'm writing my fourth book, and in truth, I don't know. That is okay. My self-worth is not enmeshed with my ability to be popular. I learned early that this is extricable, and this is fine, that I do not want anything resembling this, that I am just fine as the independent entity I've always been. Do not call for my attention, the sure way to not get what you want, to demonstrate thirst for it over and over. I don't respond to desperation. There is an alchemy to surviving the public. Chilled tequila, headphones, CBD, confidence to the point of arrogance. It follows me, but it also is me. Over time, I have continued to be good. I have continued to trust despite it all. You are welcome. I have brought it in as if from a storm. A dew trembles along its skin. Its deeply solemn core of knowing it and doing it anyway. The thing that grants me power, my whiteness, is also the thing I betray willfully. Your art does not interest me unless it intends to shred itself into a flay and abject and abundance of pain that revels in itself, its ability to be fully what it is. I want to feel it. I want to feel. Make me feel it. Make me feel it all. I want the lurch, the yank, the sharp, the throb, the end, the yes. It is okay to hide from it at first. The it unraveled, the it unapology, the it no, it hinged, it younger, it spooned, it cast, it, yesterglow. The after that becomes the it, the premonition of the thing you fear, the it, the proof everyone needed, the it, the grim, the receipt, the door left guarded, the promise of freedom at the end of the dungeon, the assassination, the alimony, the pathology, it. It bangs on the bar seat. It bangs on the bar 2 seats down. It feels heard only when it shouts. It is threatened, and it does what it can to disguise it. The weakness that grows and grows. It, yes, it. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for that impactful reading and for the stories you told about Katherine and the effect that she had on you. And I've got a couple of questions for both of you, and I think Dr. Horvitz may as well, but I want to open it up to the folks who are watching. If you have a question for Jesse or Zephyr, please put it in the chat box and we'll read your question aloud to either one of them or both of them if it's a question for both of them. But I have a question for both of you starting out, and Zephyr, I guess you can start since you went first. You know, I went to UNCA, I graduated in 2000, and now I'm back as writer in residence, and it still feels the same. Professors come and go. We've got young folks like, you know, Kirk and Ann are on here, and Mildred and Rachel, and then, you know, just to say more recently arrived folks, but it still feels the same. And hearing y'all talk about it, it felt like it was an encouraging place, a nurturing place, a safe place to kind of stretch yourself a little bit. How did you go about leaving UNCA? You're both in graduate programs or recent graduates of programs, and find a community, foster a community, try to replicate community, try to germinate community. Can you talk about that a little bit? I mean, if maybe you haven't, maybe you have, but what was it like going from UNCA to a different community?
Yeah, I guess I can start with that very widely encompassing question. It was an adjustment, right? I think UNCA, like Jesse in some ways, UNCA was also a recalibration for me. I went to high school at the School of Science and Math and thought that I was going into a kind of STEM career, and that flamed out in a kind of spectacular failure. And I found myself, like many people do, a literature major after that. And I think that there are ways in which I kind of found things I didn't even know I was looking for at UNCA around space to kind of go out and look at sort of embrace a wide range of kind of non-traditional. I had a lot of creative freedom with everything that I did at UNCA, and I think that and the rigor of the program and the kind of intellectual acuity of all of the faculty and members in the program all really helped me situate myself in ways, like I said, that I didn't know I was looking for. So I think firstly, after I graduated, it was just finding ways in which I could replicate that on my own. I know that Juniper Benz in Asheville provided a really great model for me for ways in which to start building a literary community outside of the confines of school. And I think that when I moved to New York, it was sort of a why not do this kind of move. And of course, I found myself there, but I found other communities there as well. But I was always looking for a kind of creative and wide-ranging approach to it's. I'm floundering a bit because it's such a good question and there's not an easy answer. UNCA was incredible. I really got a lot from it, and it took a while to establish communities. While I was there, one of the things that I got from that was the ability to establish communities outside of the school as well. I was involved with student activism, as all of my professors probably recall. I was involved in a bunch of organizing and a bunch of reading outside the school as well. And I think having the academic freedom to pursue those things as well really equipped me to kind of find a more unstructured way into them as well. There's not an easy answer, but it took a while, and I'm not sure I would have ended up where I am now without UNCA, is as concise as I can make that.
Jesse? Jesse?
Can you repeat the question?
How did you, speaking of the strength of community, I mean, you clearly met the love of your life thanks to UNC Asheville.
Actually, but I'll tell you that.
But to have such a strong community as an undergraduate, then to go to a graduate program, what is it like fostering a community, maybe being without a community, finding a new community? What has that experience been like? I'm mostly asking on behalf of our current students, because I always encourage them, look around you, make friends with these people, share your work with these people, build a community here.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I would say that so many of the people that I'm still close with are from UNC Asheville. I like to be like, oh, I was there at a special time, and that's partially true, but actually I think there were, it kind of attracts some unique and inquisitive kinds of people. And so if you are finding that you're really connecting with someone now as an undergraduate, absolutely keep texting them or just like responding to their Instagram stories or whatever. Other like people that I was a student with that are in this group, I still talk to. And I have my boyfriend and I have Zephyr, who's also my girlfriend in CA. That was a million years ago, but is that embarrassing? I'm so sorry. Okay, sorry. But you know, there's of a magic to having you can go to where people are gonna kind of value your creative output. I was trying to figure out a way to work in that, like, I kind of hate grad school, partially because it's not like UNCA at all. There's like a lot of people that I don't think are as creative or as like expansive in their thinking, that are really drawn to like professional careers, I think, in like writing and like literature studies, which is not even what I do, but I don't know. I think it's important to honor your intuition about people that you're connecting with now. And, you know, it's not clingy to like want to be close to people that you find really interesting. You know, respect each other's boundaries and make sure that you're clear about what those look like. But I've kept friends from UNCA for 10 years. So, and I intend to probably till I'm gone.
Thank you, Jesse and Zephyr. Your readings were both amazing. A student in my queer arts class asks, Michaela, says, for both Jesse and Zephyr, what is it like writing such personal pieces? Do you find it difficult to write or share them? Your pieces were incredible and the way you presented them were powerful. Thank you. So maybe we could start with Zephyr.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are a bunch of different ways in which you can go about sort of writing that. I mean, the short answer is, yeah, I think personal, or at least for me, the sort of writing that I find most personally resonant is sort of an act of survival, is something that I need to do to keep going, but it's also something that's very hard to do. So for me, finding containers for these sort of bits of myself are kind of key to the whole thing. I think that a lot of the Lizzie Borden project was kind of writing through and into these lineages of queerness and complicated relationships with family and patriarchal and structural forces that influence family, and also writing into and through the death of my father, who died very shortly after I started the project. And I think for all of that, I mentioned this very briefly when I made an appearance in Lori's queer arts, queer writing class. Thank you for having me again. But I think persona, which is sort of assuming this voice of Lizzie Borden, was a way of kind of building this box where I could allow myself to be more vulnerable, to get into these sorts of truths or violences or complexities that were difficult to speak to more outright. And so much of my practice in general is finding ways in which I can build a container, whether that be formally, whether that be sort of aesthetically, whether that be in terms of structural theme, to go into these more personal moments. Was there did that answer the question?
Oh yeah, and I wonder if Jesse has something to add or say about that.
Yeah, that's a hard question, because I think, I don't know, my approach to writing has changed really dramatically over time, and I used to do a lot more kind of like persona or writing about someone else's experience or some like as a third party witnessing something. And I don't do that at all anymore. And I think part of it was the way that I experienced my own body has really changed. I started to develop some kind of still undiagnosed chronic illness a few years ago, and that really impacted the ways that I had kind of ignored my body or taken my body for granted in my previous life, before I had to be more aware of what I was doing with my actual physical self, and what kind of like material conditions I had to figure out and set up so that I could make that big adjustment in my relationship to my body. But writing, through that whole process, writing kind of became almost like a spiritual practice, almost like kind of ritualistic. Like it was a lot less like I will write about a subject, and a lot more like I'm exhausted at the end of a long day of commuting and being stressed out, and I'm in a lot of pain, and I need to just kind of get something out, which Zephyr mentioned in her answer to this. But I think being forced to really reckon with what I had expected of my body, and the fact that that was changing really dramatically while I was inside of it, really shifted the way that I had to face my own writing. And I could no longer just kind of be like a distant observer of whatever it was that I was writing about, but I had to get as close as possibly could, or it wasn't fulfilling the needs that I realized. Hope that helps. I hope you don't have to be sick to deal with it. But.
No, but I think that's a great avenue to reaching the personal, by being in touch with your body, and in that way, I think that's a great observation. The next question's for Zephyr. Chris asks, Zephyr, what drew you to Elizabeth Borden, and how, if at all, do you believe poetry can bring history to life in ways that prose cannot? That's a pretty interesting question.
Hey, Chris. We worked together at the UNCA Writing Center way back when, so it's good to see you again. So what drew me to Lizzie Borden? Well, I started off kind of by, in my last answer, I made this kind of glib like joke about the humanities or literature being the providence of people who like sort of wound up not kind of taking the path of not cutting it in science, which I actually don't agree with at all. I think that there's really a kind of embrace of multiplicities of meaning in literature, specifically of kind of thinking about structures in terms of intersecting parts that don't just necessarily kind of replicate these sort of monomyths, right? These ideas that, oh, I tell you this, so it has to be true. There's a lot more of a process of inquiry. And I think in terms of poetry bringing history to life, one of the things that compels me the most about it is, in a lot of ways, poetry is allowed to be more subjective than history. There's space to kind of question official documents and make your way in between these like various contradictory truths. And I think that's more accurate to the way in which we live our lives. And I think that's more meaningful and more useful in terms of establishing a way in which to live one's life. Not that I think that my writing is necessarily being like, you should do this, you shouldn't do this. The main character of my poetry collection is a abused woman who murdered her father, and it's not like positioned as like an exclusively good or bad thing. But I think sort of poetry became, and literature more generally, is a way in which to kind of dwell in this in-between place, to dwell on these multiple meanings in ways that I think are interesting and productive, and just really sort of speak to me more in terms of connecting my own life into this larger historical context as well. In terms of what drew me to her, I saw a play about her when I was in third grade, and it really scared me. And I had nightmares about it for a year. And I was browsing the Brooklyn Public Library at the start of 2016, and I just was lingering in the nonfiction section and came across this book of sort of archival information about her. And it kind of all like came back to me. I was like, oh, this is something that I was obsessed with when I was a little kid. Why was this the case when I was still so, pliable or whatever? And then all of that kind of spawned from that initial moment. Jessie's laughing. She was present at the time. But may or may not have encouraged me to keep working on the project, which maybe hints at another question I saw in the chat, but I want to leave that to a little bit later.
All right, well, we had a couple questions here, and maybe we could combine a couple of these questions. So Lucy asks, how do you create community, support your process without the structure of the university? But also, what are your biggest sources of creative inspiration? So maybe we could start off with Jessie answering that and go back to Zephyr.
Sure. I am not great at, I like one-on-one relationships. Friendships work better for me on a one-on-one basis. So even though at UNCA I did have a kind of larger community, there was still a need for me to develop those individual connections with people. So because of that, trying to make like a larger writing community is weird for me and tricky. Also, I would say in New York, there's a lot of extremely wealthy people, and setting up and making decisions about literary events and publishing that are very exclusionary and don't take into account people's class status, people's disability status, important factors that are going to impact people's ability to even enter a particular kind of space. So there's definitely some structural barriers that are hard to kind of reckon with, but honestly, like Zephyr and I she talks about writing way more than I talk about writing. But we talk about that, and I have a couple of other people that I kind of do writing projects with on a one-on-one basis. That's just always what's worked best for me, and so it's definitely different from having like a workshop setting. But I think there's a lot of value in being able to get really close to someone else's process and someone else's ways that they work with language, that you can develop, I think, more fully in a kind of one-on-one relationship than you can in a bigger group relationship. So, knowing what works for you has been really helpful to me, because I know I can't like go to a reading where I don't know anybody and like talk to everybody. That's not a thing that really works for me. But if that's an environment you thrive in, then like maybe that's the way that you want to approach it. I think it's really different for everybody, but knowing yourself and your needs, what kind of relationships you're looking for, has really impacted the way that I've chosen to interact with people.
Yeah, I guess I would just echo some of what Jessie said. I think that likewise, I have a lot of sort of individual relationships, very few of whom I met in my MFA program, which was not nearly as positive as my experience at UNCA was. But although it was useful for the things that I needed it to do. I think that there are a couple of people that I know from UNCA who I'm still in touch with. Reed Drake is one name that immediately comes to mind, who I know is in a couple of Holly's classes and a few others as well. But sort of finding what always stuck out to me the most about finding people to help revise is just seeing whose ways of thinking I'm interested in. I also do a lot better in kind of one-on-one modes of interaction. I think because it gives you, especially if you're writing, there are great things about a workshop format, but it's very difficult to like tailor very specifically your needs and interests and the person you're working with needs and interests. It kind of becomes more generalized the larger you spread out. So in some ways, having these one-on-one relationships, having these people who I'm like, oh, I see that you're kind of interested. I see that you're thinking about this thing in a way that I didn't think about. Maybe we can trade some writing or trade some thoughts, is one way in which I go about kind of building community. I also think of revision more holistically. Sometimes that's sharing work, but more often than not, it's having a conversation over drinks or over coffee or having friends over to my house for dinner and just sort of catching up with each other. I think the sort of Audre Lorde truism that the personal is political has kind of been generalized and generalized again, and it's applied to almost everything now. But I think there is a way that these intentional individual and group interactions are political and also are creative, are ways of structuring and rethinking things. And that's one of my inspirations, certainly. That's one way that I kind of facilitate these spaces, again, outside of the often, but not always inaccessible, larger writing communities that Jesse talked about as well.
Well, those were great responses to great questions, and I want to thank you two, to Zephyr and Jesse, for joining us tonight and for allowing us to feature your work and to share it with the Asheville and the national community, the national writing community. As a UNCA graduate and alumni writer, it's an honor to stand beside y'all, having books out there in the world, to know that we all came from the same place and have gone to different places is a great honor. And I want to thank Andrew Sean Greer for joining us as well and saying such interesting and thoughtful things about Katherine at the top of the show, and for sharing some work with us as well. Lori?
I just want to thank everybody for coming. Thank you for Kayla and Colin and Katherine's parents for coming. Thank you, Katherine, for bringing us together and for sharing your life with us. And may we continue. Thank you, Katherine. Thank you, everybody, for coming. This was great. Thank you, Jesse, Andrew, and Zephyr for sharing your work and your life with us. Thanks.
Good night, everybody.